Most men think power is force, that dominance comes from being the loudest, the strongest, the most aggressive. That winning means overpowering opposition through direct confrontation. That's why they lose before the fight even begins. Because they're playing a game that exhausts resources, creates enemies, and produces temporary victories at best. Niccolo Machiavelli understood something dangerous that most never grasp. The strongest man in the room is usually the one who never needs to prove it. The one who wins without fighting, who controls without confronting, who dominates without displaying dominance. Not because he's weak or afraid of conflict, but because he understands that force is the least efficient path to power. Machiavelli wrote something that sounds shocking at first. Never attempt to win by force what can be won by deception. That word, deception, triggers immediate resistance in most people. It sounds manipulative, unethical, Machiavellian in the negative sense people use that term. But that's not what this principle is actually about at its core. This is about efficiency in how power operates, about understanding that force is expensive in every meaningful way. It costs energy, creates resistance, generates enemies, produces unstable outcomes. Smart men don't waste energy on expensive methods when efficient ones exist. They don't fight battles they can win without fighting. They don't use force when influence accomplishes the same outcome at lower cost. Not because of moral superiority, but because of strategic superiority. Because the goal is the outcome, not the process of achieving it. And force is often the worst process for achieving sustainable outcomes. Most people misunderstand what force actually represents in power dynamics. They think force is strength, dominance, the ultimate expression of power. But force is what people use when they've already lost control of a situation. When emotions have taken over rational decision-making. When they need to react because they failed to position properly beforehand. When they have no other option because they lack the sophistication for better options. Force is the last resort of people who couldn't win through better means. But the ones who actually win consistently don't operate at the level of last resorts. They don't react to situations after they've developed badly. They position themselves so situations develop favorably from the beginning. They create conditions where their desired outcomes emerge naturally. Without confrontation, without force, without the costs that force creates. They don't react to changing circumstances. They shape circumstances. And shaping circumstances is a completely different game than reacting to them. The moment you raise your voice in an argument, you expose your need to be heard. You're signaling that your position isn't strong enough to stand on its own, that you require volume to compensate for weak logic or lack of authority, that you're emotionally invested in a way that makes you controllable. All of that is visible to anyone observing with strategic awareness. They see someone losing control, losing frame, losing power in real time. The moment you argue extensively, you show dependence on someone else's validation. You need them to agree, to understand, to acknowledge your perspective. That need gives them power over you because they can withhold what you need. They can refuse to be convinced, refuse to agree, refuse to validate. And your continued arguing just demonstrates your continued dependence, while they remain unmoved and in control of the frame. The moment you fight, physically or metaphorically, you prove you couldn't control the situation earlier. Fighting is admission that all more sophisticated methods failed or were never attempted. That you let circumstances develop to the point where force became necessary. That you lacked the skill, patience, or intelligence to win before fighting was required. So fighting, even when you win the fight, demonstrates prior failure. Failure to position properly, failure to influence effectively, failure to control perception. The fight itself is evidence that you lost control earlier in the process, while someone truly skilled never lets situations develop to that point. They win long before fighting becomes relevant because they shape the entire context. Real power operates before conflict even exists in any visible form. It works at the level of perception, expectation, assumption, frame. It shapes how people perceive situations before situations fully develop. It influences what options people think they have before they choose. It creates context where desired outcomes feel natural and undesired ones feel wrong. All of this happens invisibly, beneath the level most people consciously notice. They think they're making free choices based on objective circumstances, but the circumstances were shaped, the options were framed, the perceptions were influenced, all by someone operating at a level they don't perceive. Power shapes perception first, because perception determines everything else. How people perceive a situation determines what actions seem appropriate. How people perceive you determines what behaviors they expect and tolerate. How people perceive their options determines what choices they make. So controlling perception is controlling outcomes without appearing to control anything. It's invisible power that people don't resist because they don't notice it operating. They just notice that things develop favorably for you without understanding why. That outcomes consistently align with your interests across different situations. That somehow you keep winning without seeming to fight for wins. All of it looks like luck or natural advantage to people who don't understand the mechanism. But it's neither luck nor natural advantage. It's strategic perception management. It influences decisions without asking for permission to influence, without announcing that influence is happening, without giving people opportunity to resist because they don't know it's occurring, just quietly shaping how situations are perceived and therefore how they develop. This is what Machiavelli meant by winning through deception rather than force. Not lying or fraud, but shaping perception strategically, making people move in directions that serve your goals without realizing they're being directed, creating conditions where your desired outcomes emerge as natural results. While force does the opposite, it announces your intentions and creates resistance. The most dangerous man in any room isn't the aggressive one. Aggression is obvious, predictable, manageable once you recognize it. You see the aggressive person coming, and you prepare accordingly. You know their moves before they make them because aggression is limited in options. The dangerous man is calculated, operating at levels aggression can't access. He's not reactive, he's deliberate in every move. He doesn't display his intentions or telegraph his strategies. He doesn't need to dominate conversations or spaces visibly. He just lets others believe they're in control of situations, lets them think they're making autonomous decisions, lets them feel like they're driving outcomes, while every outcome quietly aligns in his favor through invisible influence, through framing he established, through perceptions he shaped, through contexts he created. All of it invisible to people who only understand visible power. They see his lack of force and mistake it for lack of power. They see his calm and mistake it for passivity. They see his silence and mistake it for having nothing to say, all while he's controlling the entire situation at levels they can't perceive. That's invisible power, the kind that works because it's invisible, the kind that doesn't create resistance because people don't know it's operating, the kind that produces sustainable outcomes, because people think outcomes are natural. This principle applies constantly in everyday situations most people face. In conversations, the person who controls perception controls direction, not the loudest speaker or the most aggressive arguer. The one who frames what's being discussed and what the relevant considerations are, who defines what outcomes are acceptable and what would be unreasonable, who shapes how others perceive their options and interests, all without announcing they're doing any of this. Just through careful word choice, strategic questions, selective information sharing, through managing what's visible and what remains invisible in the discussion. The other participants think they're having an open conversation. But the frame is controlled, the direction is influenced, the outcome is shaped, all by someone who understands that controlling conversation flow is controlling outcomes. In business negotiations, power isn't about being tougher or more demanding. It's about shaping what both parties perceive as reasonable, about creating context where your preferred terms feel fair and natural, about managing information asymmetry so you know more than you reveal, about positioning yourself so alternatives to agreement look worse than agreement. All without force, without demands, without confrontation that creates resistance. Just strategic positioning that makes desired outcomes the path of least resistance. The other party thinks they negotiated freely and reached mutual agreement, but the entire context was shaped to produce that specific agreement by someone who understood that shaping context is more powerful than demanding terms. In relationships, power doesn't come from dominating or controlling through force. Those approaches create resentment and eventual rebellion or escape. Power comes from shaping how the relationship is perceived and what behaviors feel natural within it. From creating context where your preferences align with what feels right to both parties. From managing perception so your boundaries feel reasonable rather than restrictive. From positioning yourself so accommodating you feels like choice rather than obligation. All of which creates stable dynamics where others willingly behave in ways that serve you, not because you forced them, but because you shaped context where that behavior feels right, where they're doing what they want and what you want is the same thing. Because you understood their psychology well enough to align those things invisibly. The one who controls perception controls direction in any human dynamic. Not by force, not by manipulation in the crude sense, but by understanding human nature. By knowing what drives people's decisions beneath their conscious awareness. By recognizing what frames feel natural and what creates resistance. By being sophisticated enough to work at the level of context and perception, rather than the crude level of force and direct confrontation. That sophistication is what separates average men from powerful ones. Average men react to situations as they find them. They argue when they disagree, they fight when challenged, they prove when questioned. All reactive behavior that demonstrates they're not controlling situations, just responding to situations someone else created or circumstances shaped. They're playing the game at the level of visible moves and direct confrontation, which is exactly where they lose to anyone operating at higher levels. They argue extensively trying to convince, proving they need the other person's agreement. They prove themselves constantly, proving they need external validation of their worth. They push hard for outcomes, proving they couldn't position for outcomes to emerge naturally. All of it demonstrates operation at reactive level rather than strategic level. Powerful men observe situations before engaging with them. They watch how dynamics develop, what people respond to, what frames are operating. They identify leverage points where small influence creates large effects. They recognize which perceptions need shaping to produce desired outcomes, all before taking any visible action that commits them to a position. That observation period is what average men skip because it feels inactive. It feels like nothing is happening, like they're not doing anything. But observation is active at strategic level even when it's invisible. It's gathering information that enables precision later. It's understanding the situation deeply enough to influence it effectively. It's patience that creates advantage rather than reacting prematurely. They wait for right moments rather than forcing wrong moments. They understand that timing matters more than intensity in most situations. That acting at the right moment with minimum force beats acting constantly with maximum force. So they wait while others rush. They observe while others react. And that patience becomes strategic advantage others never develop, because they can't tolerate the discomfort of not acting immediately. They position themselves before acting rather than acting and hoping. They create favorable context before pursuing outcomes. They shape perceptions that make outcomes natural before pushing for outcomes. They establish frames that serve them before engaging in discussions, all of which means their later actions are efficient because positioning did the work. While others' actions are inefficient because they skip positioning entirely, they just react and push and fight, using force because they lack sophistication for better methods. They win before anything begins, in the sense that outside observers recognize the visible conflict, the obvious confrontation, the apparent competition. All of that happens after the real winning already occurred at invisible levels, after perception was shaped, after context was created, after positioning was established. So what looks like winning in the visible conflict was just harvesting results of earlier invisible work. The real winning happened earlier, at levels most people don't perceive or value. At the level of shaping how situations are understood and what options seem reasonable. That's where outcomes get determined, even though that's not where attention focuses. Attention focuses on visible conflict because that's dramatic and obvious. But visible conflict is just the surface manifestation of deeper positioning. And whoever did that deeper positioning better already won before visible conflict began. Force is visible. Everyone can see it, and everyone recognizes it as an attempt at power. That visibility creates immediate resistance from people who don't want to be forced. It triggers defensive reactions, creates resentment, generates opposition, all of which makes force inefficient even when it temporarily succeeds, because the success is unstable, dependent on maintaining force continuously. The moment force is removed, people revert or rebel. So force creates endless need for more force to maintain outcomes. That's expensive, exhausting, and ultimately unsustainable. Power is invisible, operating at levels people don't consciously track. It shapes perception, influences context, manages information, frames decisions, all beneath conscious awareness of people being influenced. So it doesn't trigger resistance because people don't notice it happening. They just notice that somehow things keep developing favorably for certain people, that certain people seem to get what they want without fighting for it, that certain people's preferences keep becoming group decisions naturally. All without obvious force or manipulation they can point to and resist. That invisibility is what makes it efficient and sustainable. It doesn't require constant maintenance because people think outcomes are natural. It doesn't create resentment because people don't feel forced or manipulated. It doesn't generate opposition because there's nothing obvious to oppose. Just quiet, consistent results that accumulate into significant power over time. And the moment you understand that fundamental principle, everything changes. You stop trying to win fights through superior force or better arguments. You stop proving yourself to people whose validation you don't actually need. You stop pushing directly for outcomes when positioning would work better. You start operating at the level of context, perception, frame, positioning, at the level where real power operates invisibly and efficiently, where small influences create large effects because they're working with human psychology, where patience and observation create advantage that force and speed destroy, where sophistication replaces intensity as the measure of effectiveness. You stop trying to win fights at all in the conventional sense, and start controlling outcomes at levels where fighting becomes irrelevant, where your desired results emerge naturally from contexts you created, where people move in directions you prefer without being told or forced, where power operates invisibly but effectively in producing consistent results. That's Machiavellian power in its true form, not the caricature people imagine, not crude manipulation or obvious deception, but sophisticated understanding of human nature and how perception shapes reality, applied strategically to produce outcomes efficiently without waste or resistance. Force is visible, crude, expensive, and ultimately weak, despite appearing strong. Power is invisible, sophisticated, efficient, and ultimately strong, despite appearing passive. And the moment you understand that distinction completely, you stop trying to win through force. You start controlling outcomes through invisible influence. And that makes you dangerous in a way forceful people never achieve. Because they're playing a game you've moved beyond, operating at levels they don't perceive with methods they don't understand, winning consistently while they're still figuring out how to fight better. That's the art of invisible power that Machiavelli described centuries ago. Still relevant, still powerful, still misunderstood by most people, who keep trying to win through force while losing to invisible power they never see coming.